Hello, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This episode is a really interesting and insightful conversation with the designer Ruben Pater. Ruben most recently published the excellent book, The Politics of Design, which looks at the cultural and political biases of visual communication. But so much of his work seeks to kind of blur this line between design and journalism and covers topics like surveillance and drones and censorship. And I loved this book and felt like he was writing about so many of the topics that come up often on this podcast. So I reached out to Ruben and we spoke recently about the book, but also about research and writing and design criticism and the importance of studying and talking about design work that's outside of the Western work that typically gets canonized. And honestly, that's just the beginning of it. We covered so much in this wide-ranging conversation. I left inspired and engaged. Ruben's an articulate and thoughtful designer, and I am a big fan of his work, and it was a pleasure to talk to him about these subjects that we're both interested in. So I encourage you to pick up the book, The Politics of Design, and enjoy my conversation with Ruben Pater. I thought a good way to start was I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your background, because I like on your website, Untold Stories, I like how you have this phrase that your work is interested in the relationship between journalism and design. Did you study both of those things in school, or how did you kind of arrive at this kind of hybrid practice, or where did that interest come from?
So I studied graphic design, and much like yourself, first I worked at different studios, and then after a while I decided to do a master degree because I wanted to kind of switch the way I was looking at design and working with it. But for me, definitely text and writing always has been part of my work. And even at studios, I was like probably maybe more than averagely interested in design briefs and the background
Right.
of what the client was, what was basically asking for, which was not always something that the clients were waiting for. So that was also interesting.
Yeah.
So there's a reason why I don't call myself a journalist, because I have a lot of respect for good journalism. And that's something that doesn't come easy. So I would not want to compare myself to people who are doing this for such a long time and in such a great way. But I do find it very interesting. I feel connected to the way that journalists kind of work and how far they will go to kind of find out these things that are maybe not visible on the surface.
So do you still refer to yourself as a designer? Like, do you think that the work that you're doing as graphic design?
Yeah, that's how I present myself. Of course, what you see in this kind of, especially the kind of designers that studied with me, you see that a lot of them, they call themselves researchers or they call themselves artists. I think that's something that's entirely up to yourself. These kind of boundaries are, social constructions anyway.
Right.
And the reason why I don't call myself an artist is very simple. It's just about myself that what I found really important and what I also want to get people to maybe kind of react positively or negatively on my work is not just about the idea and the aesthetics, but especially does it reach a large enough audience? So I still feel like I'm working in assignments, even though sometimes I come up with my own projects. I do feel that the kind of public or the larger public is my audience, and if they don't see my work or they don't understand it, then for me I've done something wrong. So I think for me that's kind of an anchor point to judge my work, just personally. That that I have to go as far as possible to kind of bring this project into the world to a larger audience, and preferably outside a kind of gallery or design or art context.
Right. Okay. Oh, so that's interesting, because that was actually that sets up two questions that I had for you. The first one was, you mentioned that you kind of worked traditionally as a graphic designer in a studio and then went back to school. Did you know where you were headed at that point, or did you kind of have a direction that you were interested in, or what were you thinking at that time? Or like, what more did you want out of your design practice at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I think also for people who do a master degree in design, I think the moment in your life that you decide to do this, or what it means for yourself, for your practice, is very personal.
Yeah.
So I was definitely not one of the standard students, having worked already for 10 years,
Okay.
before starting to study. Many of the students at the Sandberg Institute where I studied, they came straight out of art school. So for me, it was really, first of all, it was a response to the way the industry works. So I think for me, it was very important always to make design work that is visible. Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of stigma that people prefer cultural clients over commercial clients,
right.
But I actually found that if you work for a cultural client, it can actually be just as much a horrible client, or right. It can be just as much a very uncomfortable process. And some of the best clients I've worked for example, in education, where they were doing school books. And all the people I worked for, they were teachers as well. And you really felt the passion. So they were not making these school books out of... I mean, there were marketing people there, and there was certainly an incentive to keep a kind of market share. But you really felt these people wanted to just educate.
Yeah.
So I felt very like connected to that and of course the response for doing a master's was of course all these instances where you work for a client, where you feel you're basically making wallpaper right. for a building that's actually breaking down in the inside.
Right. So I'm trying to think how to phrase this exactly. I liked when you were talking about that you see yourself as a designer, because you're still, even in these projects that are a little bit more research based or personal, like, refer to yourself as a designer still, because you're still about communicating a message, whether it is a personal project or for clients. And something like Politics of Design, and I was reading some of the other pieces that you have on your site. Do you think about audience when you're working on those, or who is the kind of desired audience for a project like that?
Yeah, so I definitely think about audience. So I think that's one of the reasons probably why I don't call myself an artist or a researcher or an academic, but I prefer the word designer, because I think also, especially graphic designers, I think what they are good at, I mean, they're also not good at a lot of things, but what they are good at is speaking to different audiences. I think that's kind of a skill you have to develop. So the Politics of Design is, of course, directed at designers, but then in the largest kind of possible scope. So working in advertising, doing internet banners, all these kind of layers of design is what the book is meant for.
Right.
And I think with other works, I mean it's probably still a lot of times kind of local, if the topic is local, but I try to kind of open that up as much as possible. I mean, basically it means that I try not to kind of assume a too academic tone.
Okay.
And sometimes that can, especially if you're reading a lot, that can you have to kind of remind yourself of that.
Right.
So this is something I find important, but I also find it important not to kind of dumb down things too much, or that everything is like allowed because I am trying to communicate to a large audience. I think you should still discuss things like aesthetics, and also kind of creativity of language. I mean, just basically saying you want to kind of communicate to a large audience does not necessarily mean it has to be bland or it has to be dumbed down.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Let's. I wanted to talk about the Politics of Design, because I think it's a I think it's actually a good way to talk about all of your work, and I think it is such a fascinating project and a fascinating kind of thesis. Um, what what were the kind of origins of that, or what were you what started you on that project?
Yeah, so just like I think my other design work, the politics of design especially is rooted in my work at studios. So at the last studio I worked, which is called Lava in Amsterdam, I was a little bit doing some work with kind of how do you put that, international cultural context. So
Okay.
I mean, once I think in the most, I mean, I went to Kenya and Tanzania to do one project, for example, and also in a very strange assignment I did there was design the identities for two airports in Siberia,
Oh wow.
both two airports that I was not allowed to visit. I mean, there was no like funding for,
Yeah.
going there. So I found myself like trying to design an identity in a language or in a writing system that I was not very familiar with, about places where I had no knowledge, what they were about.
Right.
And I think you see that in the Netherlands and probably at other studios in the world, that especially the BRIC countries like China and Russia are they're kind of there are much more clients coming from those areas.
Right.
And you see that designers are struggling with kind of how do I can I even work there, and what's my role as a designer in a kind of completely different cultural context. So I already started collecting these kind of ideas when I was working there.
Okay. So are you still doing client work in addition to these research projects? Those are happening kind of at the same time?
I mean, I do sometimes do assignments. I also have to admit they don't really ask me for those. So it's not that I'm like against assignments. It's just that people don't really, ask me to do them. I mean, I just designed a book for a publishing house in Amsterdam, and I'm currently working on two exhibitions where I was actually asked by as a spatial and graphic designer for two exhibitions in Bristol and Amsterdam. But then I'm kind of asked from a kind of cultural and art context. But it's still an assignment, but not in the way I used to do them at the studios.
Okay, so these types of I'm calling them research projects. What do you kind of call these, like politics of design or the espionage one? Do you kind of have a term for those?
Well, I mean, the politics of design is basically a book.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's, I mean, for any kind of book, I think you need to do like research and writing and all these kinds of things. And the espionage puzzles is, I think, a self-initiated design or illustration assignment. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't necessarily call them research because I think actually a lot of designers, they do research, maybe even all designers, even if their work is like pure aesthetic or very, very minimal. I think actually a lot of designers think very hard and careful about these things, but not everyone kind of, shows that online. Some people actually prefer to only show the kind of outcome or and I realized that it means a lot to me, or it's for myself and my own process very meaningful to share like the whole, not just the end result of the project, but also what came before and what comes after it.
Right.
I mean, I think personally, so this is why I also present it this way on my website, because I'm very interested in kind of those parts of the design process.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly what my next question was going to be. Like you set that up kind of perfectly. I was interested, do you see the work that you do for clients differently than the work that you put up on your website, or are they all part of the same process and you're just illuminating a part that a lot of designers don't show?
Yeah, which could also be a way of selectively portfolio, what you sometimes see, which is perfectly normal, of course. My kind of the rule is for my website that I only show projects that have enough foundation in kind of thinking and, I don't know, interesting, side branches of ideas that I can make like a story out of that.
Okay.
So I guess one of the smallest, kind of most design-oriented projects on it is this poster I did for, which is basically I just did the poster and a small flyer for the Sandberg final year show.
Okay.
But I found so many. It's called The Future So Bright,
Mm-hmm.
and but I found so many kind of interesting relations in this assignment that I didn't feel it was like all. It was not all like part of the end result. So I decided to show that one. But there's a lot of projects I did, especially when I'm just doing a poster or a one-off kind of thing, where there's not necessarily enough. Enough kind of foundation or enough interesting elements to it to show it.
Right.
So that's not necessarily about whether it's for a client or not, but I think that's more, more the extent where I feel that my contribution to the project is kind of, has like a strong foundation to it. I think.
Yeah. It's almost like it's almost like you're making your thinking or your process visual, and sharing that as a story in addition to just making the artifact that you've made. You're actually making the process part of the artifact.
Sure.
I'm curious how I think it's interesting that like the politics of design was kind of birthed out of projects that you were actually working on. Has doing these research projects influenced how you are as a designer when you're back working with clients? Has that relationship gone both ways?
Well, like I said, I have not done that many assignments since I've. But it was interesting when I did the book design for a publishing house. The first thing they said is like, you make all these books, but you also write the content for these books. So how will you design a book that you didn't write yourself? So for me, that's not really like a big issue. There's not really, but I can imagine that because as a designer you also need to kind of empathize and kind of inhibit the topic and ideas of someone else and represent them the best way possible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in many design jobs, you're actually not expected, and actually very good designers actually not expected to show his or her personal opinions or ideas about this particular about this particular topic. I mean, that's of course the whole kind of modernist design philosophy. When you make a book cover, nobody's interested in what the designer thinks of the book. Your only job is to kind of make a vessel for the thoughts and ideas of the writer.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's possible?
Well, that's also, of course, what the politics of design is about a little bit. I mean, I have a lot of respect for the way that Experimental Jet Set kind of how they have kind of organized their practice and how they believe very firmly in this idea, that they are just passing the kind of message. But then again, the kind of what happens then is the double-sided after effect is, of course, that designers like Experimental Jet Set have become so well known that their kind of signature becomes a kind of promotional image for themselves.
Right.
Just the way that a building from a famous architect more relates to the architect than it actually does to the owner of the building or the person who had the building built, for example.
Right.
But of course, you cannot escape that as a designer. So but it's an interesting. I think it's an interesting discussion. I don't have like a single answer to what that. I mean, the only thing I say in my book is obviously that if a designer says I'm neutral, the way I designed this book has absolutely like no impact on how it is perceived. I think that is something that does not exist.
Yeah, I agree. That's something I've been thinking about a lot because when I studied graphic design in my undergraduate classes, that's how I learned about what a designer is they design these kind of invisible vessels for content to feed through. And I thought for a long time that I was not injecting my point of view. And I feel like the longer I design, the more removed from that notion I feel, or the more impossible that, that idea actually seems like it could be.
Hmm.
I'm curious. I'm talking to you. I'm actually going to be interviewing Experimental Jet Set also, and
Great.
then there's people like Metahaven, and I just recently interviewed Ruben Pater and Mark Mulder. Do you know them?
Is Mark Mulder? He's Dutch, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's. I taught at in Rotterdam for a while, and he
Oh yeah.
was one of the teachers there. So yeah.
Yeah, he both of them were here for a workshop here in Baltimore, so I interviewed them, and they're I think I see a lot of similarities between things they're interested in and things that you're interested in, with a very strong emphasis on research. And I think Metahaven has a bit of that, and I think Experimental Jet Set even has a bit of that in it. And I'm wondering, is that common in the design culture or design education where you guys kind of came up, or what is it about kind of Dutch design that fosters that kind of critical interest in how they work?
Yeah, that's
I
that's
know
a
that's
million dollar
I
question.
know that's a big question.
Yeah. No, but it's interesting. I mean, like I try to avoid. It's very difficult to kind of frame, like, imagine somebody was interview about your work and would frame you as
Yeah.
a designer from New England. I
Right.
mean, that's maybe you feel more connected to a designer in Germany or a designer in Mexico. So it's tempting, and of course there's some kind of background to it, because people they're educated at schools, and these schools have teachers, and these teachers had their teachers. And
Right.
I mean, for example, there's in the way I was taught. So one of my teachers in school, he worked for Sol Bass. So he
Oh.
was a modernist thought Dutch designer
Oh, interesting.
who worked in the US for quite a long time. So he inhabits kind of both of these things. So the way that modernism took off in the post-war United States, but also the way it kind of started in the kind of European in the kind of European era.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you can always, I think, make connections. But yeah, and so far as reaches, I mean, actually, a lot of people say that actually Dutch designers are actually known for actually not doing any research,
Oh,
and
interesting.
being very well, especially when it comes to product design, being very well in making these iconic
Mm-hmm.
comic and but also like playful statements that really react on the object or the material. And there's also a lot of graphic designers who do that.
Oh, interesting. I wanna talk a little bit about criticism and design criticism, since that's kind of a lot of where my interest is. And I feel like,
Yeah.
your work is interesting because it's using design as a type of criticism, I think. And so I'm wondering how you think about the discourse around design, and how you're kind of participating in that through your own work, but then also, what are other things that you think designers should be talking about? I mean, you cover a lot of that in Politics of Design, I think, but just how do you think about that whole space and discourse?
Hmm. Yeah. So through the book, I mean, I haven't been that busy with like design criticism or design discourse. I actually try to avoid like reading a lot about design, because well, some of it can be, I mean, it can be very much on the promotional side,
Yeah.
which is very logical. also in the Netherlands, we have a much different kind of system where it's not possible to do a PhD or even to do a master degree in design criticism. So this is something that in the US has been for a much longer time possible.
Right.
So what happens in the Netherlands is that architectural criticism, which is a study at the university, and art criticism, these are kind of quite well developed, but design criticism is something that is kind of fallen between the cracks. And for my book, I had to kind of get into a lot of it, or at least some of it. And I find it difficult to. I mean, what we can see in the Netherlands right now is because, I mean, the first thing I said is there's a lack of people being educated in design criticism, and the second thing is also that the only design magazines that we had in the Netherlands have become defunct because of the lack of funding.
Right.
So there's also now no places anymore in the Netherlands which offer a platform for design criticism, which is a kind of widespread complaint from designers both and writers.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's the same here in the States also. A lot of design criticism has fallen by, kind of fallen out of favor because of economics or, like you were saying, commercial interests. And design writing becomes kind of a thing to promote the designer. Is that something that you would see? Do you see a value in it? Like, would you like there to be more of it? Or I know you mentioned that you try not to read a lot of it, but what would you like to see if there was more of it?
Yeah, but maybe if I want to kind of respond in kind of numerous ways, like first of all, what really came out of my book is what I did not really expect or realize so much before is that the way we've been discussing design history and the way we've been teaching design history is particularly flawed, at least in the context of European design schools. So I cannot speak for the US. I can imagine something similar is going on.
Yeah.
But the fact that I was taught design history started at arts and crafts movement, and this is something that, now Victor Margolin with this kind of new design history project, and also this really great book of a critical history of design from the US that came out not too long ago.
Yeah.
From two authors. So these are things that are in the right direction, but it's for me like very interesting, and this is also quite sad that most designers cannot imagine a design history book which does not feature Europe or the United States or the UK.
Right.
And this is something that we kind of have to get used to, the fact that we've been kind of design history has really kind of overlooked such a large part of the world, but also all these kind of groups in society like women doing kind of all this design work at home or in a kind of domestic sphere, kind of non-official design, which is more close to kind of DIY culture, and all these kind of practices that have been completely overlooked because they don't fit this kind of idea of the official design discourse. So I think this is really a big problem in the way we talk about design, and also the way that we still assume, and this also becomes of the way that we've been taught to think about design history, that Europe is still somehow the center of this, or the Western world is still kind of the center of this world. I read this thing on Design, which is this British design blog where two Swedish designers said, thanks to IKEA, people in China now finally have access to design. And the fact that, and I don't blame these designers because this is the way designers in Europe are trained. But I think we have to really question how we talk about design and from our perspective, and how we also kind of acknowledge other perspectives to be present as well. And that's difficult because we cannot learn everything about design history from any country, from any kind of social stratus, but we're not even close to kind of acknowledging its existence and we end up, talking about the difference between two chair designers from this
Right.
part of Italy, or two different typefaces that are, from these parts of Germany. And I think it's also something that can become a kind of blind spot that kind of brings everybody together in a very small area of design.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. It's something I've been thinking about too, because I've been thinking about how in design education, somewhere along the way here in the States, I think, and this is kind of a blanket statement, so it's not fully true, or it's not wholly true, but I think there is truth in it, that somewhere along the way, modernism became the rule, and like that became how you define good design. And that came from a very small group of white men at a very specific time in history. And now, 60 years later, we're still saying, we point to that and say, that's how you design. Like, that's good design. And how do you reconcile that in the 21st century, in a world that is more globalized, where we do need more voices? And it's like, oh, maybe that is like, maybe that was good for a time, but maybe we need to rethink what's good now and get more voices into this conversation.
No, I mean, definitely. I mean, the thing is, if it becomes much more and more complex, but that's also the nature of, the world and the way that, people design. I mean, I think there's definitely more and more interest in this topic. I mean, I was a little bit surprised that nobody else wrote about this the way that I wrote about visual communication in my book.
Yeah.
Which is also I chose to write it. I mean, in product design architecture, it's a little bit better. There's a really interesting professor from Kansas. She's originally from India, and she's writing now a book about design from kind of non-Western countries, focusing on South America, India, and and I think some countries in Oceania. But of course, I mean, so I grew up with modernist design education, and this modernism can be traced back to the 1910s in the Netherlands. So it's for me, it feels very local. And I also think that there's nothing wrong with that, with the fact that these shapes and these forms they are derived from a kind of long tradition of design. But I think we do have to kind of watch out where this slowly became the language of international capitalism, and of course now this is kind of equal to looking like Apple means you will make more money.
Right.
This is what modernism comes down to.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And of course there's and of course there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's not. We also have to watch out that we kind of assume that if a company is from Kenya, they need to look African or Kenyan or whatever that might be. They could look exactly the same as a company in the Netherlands or in the United States or in China or wherever. But we have to kind of be sensitive to the fact that all these visual cues and small details in design are not neutral, and they all represent a kind of statement.
Yeah, that's that very idea is kind of where this project started for me, and why I'm calling it Scratching the Surface is because I think that to kind of talk about design deeply today, we need to move past aesthetics, and aesthetics are important and how things look are important, but we need to look at designed objects from a political point of view, from a commercial point of view, from how it lives in the culture or is born out of the culture. And that's something I think your book does a really good job of of explaining. What's next for you, or are you working on anything kind of building off of that?
Well, also practically, and maybe also for people listening, this is also sometimes nice to hear, not just also the painful parts of the profession. It's actually because I was working on the book for 1 year. I find it quite difficult now I am longing for projects that only have to deal with aesthetics. It's because I was reading so much and rationalizing so much. And for a book like The Political Design, this is great. But I also now I really miss that kind of other part of design. So I'm really looking now for other projects that really go into that.
Yeah.
And also not necessarily, I mean, I think what I do appreciate about any kind of level of design is that design does have, and especially its aesthetics, if done well, it can have a really powerful effect that kind of supersedes wording. Because it can kind of embody different kind of interpretations or even just plain associations that are much larger than what you could do in kind of a well-written text, which can make it really actually for me, I think it can make it really powerful when we address like issues that are almost too big to put into 200 words.
Right.
So I'm still kind of excited about that. I mean, I'm now hoping next year to do a project about climate change and the extinction of species,
Yeah.
as kind of defined by Elizabeth Colbert as the sixth extinction, and to kind of imagine, now there's, especially in the art world, but also I think abroad, there's this kind of discussion of the planetary turn. So, after kind of roughly 20,000 years of human history, could we possibly imagine a world where humans are not the center of culture?
Oh,
And
interesting.
and for me, that is kind of a challenge to because already thinking about this puts you in the center of the universe. So there's this kind of philosophical paradox about imagining humans as a species and not just as the kind of top of the food chain. And that is for me something that I want to work on with different illustrators and artists, and think about the idea if we can make portraits of species, of different species. So this is something I've been thinking about a little bit lately.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I have just two more questions, and then we can wrap it up. And it kind of comes out of what you were just talking about. At the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned that you still like to refer to yourself as a designer, and that you have a lot of respect for journalists and researchers and artists. What are the skills that the designer has that can kind of bring to those fields or bring to those projects that might be different than someone who's just like strictly a journalist or strictly an artist or a researcher?
Yeah, well, of course, not really any. I mean, there are artists and journalists can do exactly the same things.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's like, but if you talk about the difference in skill or how I interpret the role of the designer,
Yeah.
is something that I really learned from this wonderful book, A Critical History of Graphic Design, by Joanna Drucker, and I forgot the name of the other author. Was this idea that the first printing houses in the kind of 16th to 18th century, everybody did everything. So I think there's a really wonderful moment in the kind of the history of print where the printer was also a type cutter, but they also wrote texts and they also cut images, and they also made sure that the business was running, etc. And I really like this idea of, I think in a way that's also sometimes a trap, but in a way designers they want to do everything themselves. They have this notion of not kind of, I mean, an architect cannot do everything themselves, so they have to be kind of a director.
Right.
But designers, a lot of times they have, especially now with digital publishing, websites, and even with these kind of, the way that printing works today, basically you do everything yourself. And that's the downside is that can have the illusion of control, where the designer says this is the truth, and that can catch up with you. But at the same time, it also gives you a lot of power to really influence all these parts of the process. And I think that's a very nice place to be in. That we are not. I mean, if a designer is publishing their stuff digitally, you basically have no kind of, you don't have like any kind of low wage factory in India building your lamps, chairs. You can kind of control everything, but also you can kind of control everything to be kind of responsible or to be to be done in a way that fits, if you have a certain kind of agenda, if you have a certain message that kind of fits this message. And I think that is, it's not necessarily a skill, but that's I think a very pleasant moment where we in now, where we have so much production capabilities at our fingertips. And in a way, those are becoming more and more democratic. You don't need, the amount of kind of. It's not like filmmaking where this is still something where you have to first like get $1 million before you can start, making the film.
Right.
If you don't want to do it in a kind of a professional, large-scale way, and of course, a lot of these tools are kind of democratizing. But I think designers are in a kind of nice area where if they can do a little bit of programming as well, the kind of power they can have to kind of connect media and to connect voices and messages is, I think, is enormous.
Yeah, I love that. That's an interesting way to think about that. My last question is kind of the opposite, is what can, for designers who are kind of working in spaces like you, what can designers learn or take from the journalists and the researchers and the artists to kind of deepen or help their own design practice?
Yeah, I think that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. Something that I've learned from kind of other disciplines, people working in other disciplines, is that designers tend to think about their projects being finished the moment it leaves the printer or it's like uploaded online.
Right.
And I think there's a kind of responsibility that goes beyond that. So, what is it supposed to look like on the street? What happens if you have 2,000 flyers left that get thrown out? So there's a kind of, there's a material kind of responsibility to that has to do with climate change and waste. But there's also the idea of that it's finished. And with online, it's changing a little bit, but usually it's like invoice paid, printers finished, now next project. And I think designers can learn from, some architects actually deal with this, urban planners, but also game designers. They tend to think more about the user. And what's interesting about that is that, especially with the way that game designers work, they'll like change things. They'll put out the game, people will play it for 1 year. They'll adapt, they'll change stuff. And I think designers can be a little bit too much in the space where they believe that, because it's finished now, this is the way they see the world. It's on their portfolio. They have like a nice image. Next project, they don't really think about the kind of consequences of what they did, and also owning up to the fact that they could be wrong. Maybe maybe say, okay, we made this website. It actually turns out it doesn't work. Let's change it. Let's make it better.
Right.
And in that sense, I think designers have to give up a little bit of their kind of pride and maybe become a little bit more modest, but also a little bit more open to collaboration. And I think that could really enhance the kind of effect that design has.
Yeah, totally.
So I see that as I don't know if this is something that could ever work, but so there was a group of physicists that got the Nobel Prize for Physics for the gravity waves.
Oh.
For example, I don't know if you. Anyway, so there's like more than 100 scientists working on this project. So for a lot of kind of areas of science, it's very normal to do a very small part in a very large kind of research, where you have like a continuous flow of information and data that is necessary to make a kind of collective effort, that can actually be something that can actually achieve results that you cannot achieve by yourself.
Right.
And I don't think designers are there yet. So it would be very interesting to have design projects that are collective and where designers actually have to sacrifice some of their kind of own. It will not be my personal favorite typeface, or it will not use my favorite colors. But maybe working with a lot of different designers or even different disciplines, we can actually achieve something that I cannot achieve myself.
Yeah, I love that. I think that I am 100% on board with that idea, and I think that that's a perfect way to end this. I am a big fan of your work. I loved the politics of design, and I really enjoyed this conversation and thought it was really, really interesting. So thank you so much for talking with me.
Well, you're welcome, and I'm looking forward to to seeing more of these interviews on your website.
This episode was recorded on November 11th, 2016. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.